For the average German soldier in 1943, the United States of America was not a real country. It was a caricature. Hans, a 20-year-old corporal in the Afrika Korps, had never met an American. Everything he knew came from the Ministry of Propaganda in Berlin. Dr. Joseph Goebbels had painted a vivid, contemptuous picture of the enemy across the Atlantic. To the German mind, America was a mongrel nation, a chaotic, racially impure society with no culture, no discipline, and no history. They were told that Americans were a collection of gangsters and cowboys, ruled by Jewish plutocrats, incapable of fighting a real war. The German soldier was taught that he was a Kulturträger, a bearer of culture, fighting against the degenerate materialism of the West. The Americans might have money, the officers told their men, but they had no heart. They were soft. They would run at the first sign of blood, and most importantly, they were far away. The propaganda machine insisted that the Atlantic Ocean was a German lake patrolled by the invincible U-boat wolf packs that were starving England and keeping America bottled up in its own hemisphere. But the reality began to crack the moment the surrender happened. For tens of thousands of Germans captured in the blistering heat of Tunisia in May 1943, or later in the hedgerows of Normandy, the first shock was not the American soldier, but the American stuff. When Hans and his units surrendered, they were starving. Their trucks had run out of fuel weeks ago. They were scavenging for bullets. Then they watched the Americans roll in. They didn't come in a few trucks. They came in an endless, rumbling river of steel. Every American soldier seemed to have his own Jeep. They had brand new boots. They smoked fresh cigarettes. They threw away half-eaten tins of meat that a German soldier would have fought a knife fight for. One German officer, watching a column of Sherman tanks pass by for 3 solid hours, reportedly muttered, "My God, the propaganda! They lied about the trucks. If they have this many trucks, what else do they have?" But the true psychological break happened when they were loaded onto the transport ships. The prisoners were terrified. They had been told that the Atlantic was a graveyard. They fully expected that once they left the coast of Europe or Africa, their ship would be torpedoed by a German U-boat. Many wrote farewell letters to their families, convinced they were being sent to a watery grave. They were herded into the holds of Liberty ships. These vessels were ugly, boxy, and welded together. They lacked the grace of German engineering. But as the convoy assembled, the prisoners were allowed on deck for fresh air, and they froze. They looked out at the horizon and saw the impossible. The ocean was not empty. It was crowded. Stretching as far as the eye could see were ships, tankers, troop transports, cargo vessels, and destroyers. It wasn't just a convoy. It was a moving city of steel. The German sailors among the POWs knew the statistics. They knew how long it took to build a ship in Hamburg or Bremen, maybe 6 months, maybe a year. Yet here they were, surrounded by hundreds of them. The Liberty ships were being built in the United States in an average of 42 days. Some were built in less than a week. As the days turned into weeks on the open ocean, a dark realization settled over the prisoners. The U-boats, the invincible wolves that Goebbels had promised were strangling America, were nowhere to be seen. The American ships steamed along with arrogant impunity, their lights often visible at night, engines thrumming with the confidence of a nation that owned the sea. The propaganda said America was a disorganized mess, but this convoy was a masterpiece of logistics. Hans looked at the crates stacked on the deck of his ship. They weren't just carrying prisoners, they were carrying war back to Europe, millions of tons of it. Standing on the deck, surrounded by the smell of salt and diesel, the German soldiers stopped boasting about the superiority of the Aryan race. They fell silent. They realized that the degenerate nation hadn't just come to fight. It had built a bridge of steel across the ocean. And if the propaganda had lied about the U-boats, if it had lied about the blockade, What else had it lied about? They hadn't even seen the American coastline yet, but for many of them, the war was already lost. It was lost the moment they realized the ocean didn't belong to Germany anymore. It belonged to the factories of Detroit.
The Atlantic crossing had been a cage of steel and seasickness. For weeks, the prisoners of war sat in the cramped, humid holds of the Liberty ships, listening to the thrum of the engines and the crash of the waves. They were men of the Wehrmacht, the Luftwaffe, and the Afrika Korps. They had been captured in the burning sands of Tunisia or the bloody hedgerows of France. They were exhausted, defeated, but still proud. They were still Germans. In the dark of the hold, the rumors flourished. The die-hard Nazis among them, the 150%ers, kept the morale up with stories from the Ministry of Propaganda. New York is in ruins, they whispered. Our U-boats have shelled the coast. The Americans are starving. They are bringing us there to work because all their men are dead. They believed that the war was, at worst, a stalemate. They believed that while Germany was suffering, the Allies were suffering just as much. Then came the order to go topside. The ship's engines slowed, the heavy steel doors opened, and the cool night air rushed in. The prisoners climbed the ladders, blinking, expecting to see a coastline bristling with coastal defense guns, searchlights, and the familiar, comforting darkness of a nation at war. In Europe, blackout was not just a rule, it was a religion. A single lit cigarette could invite a bomb. The cities of the Reich, Hamburg, Cologne, Berlin, were tombs of darkness where people scurried like rats in the shadows. The German soldiers stepped onto the deck, and the breath was knocked out of them. It wasn't the dark, it was the light. Rising out of the water was New York City, or Boston for some convoys, and it was ablaze. It was a mountain range of electricity. The skyscrapers of Manhattan were not jagged, bombed-out skeletons. They were soaring monoliths of stone and glass, glowing with an arrogant, impossible brightness. Thousands of windows were lit up. Neon signs flickered red and blue. Streetlights traced the grid of the city like veins of fire. There were no air raid sirens, no searchlights frantically scanning the clouds, no flak bursts. To the German eye, accustomed to the rubble and the cellar, it was physically painful to look at. It was a shock to the nervous system. The sheer luminosity of the city screamed one thing: safety. "They are not afraid," a young lieutenant murmured, clutching the railing. It was a devastating psychological blow. It meant that the Luftwaffe, which Goebbels had promised was raining fire on the American mainland, had never even scratched the paint. It meant that the war, which was consuming every ounce of blood and treasure in Europe, was barely an inconvenience here. As the ship drifted closer to the harbor, the details became even more crushing. They saw the West Side Highway. It was jammed with cars, not military trucks, but civilian automobiles, Buicks, Fords, Packards, with their headlights on. "Look at the gasoline," a tank commander whispered. In Germany, fuel was liquid gold. Panzers sat abandoned in fields because they had no diesel. Here, civilians were burning gasoline just to drive home for dinner. The Americans had so much fuel they didn't even bother to ration it for the war effort. They saw the harbor infrastructure. The cranes were swinging, loading ships with crates of food, ammunition, and machinery. The docks were intact. There were no craters, no twisted metal. The workers on the pier didn't look like the hollow-cheeked slave laborers of the East. They looked healthy, well-fed, shouting and laughing as they worked. One prisoner later recalled the moment he saw a billboard advertising Coca-Cola. It was bright, colorful, and frivolous. It was an advertisement for a soft drink in the middle of a world war. It made him want to weep. It showed a society so wealthy, so insulated from the horror that it could worry about soft drinks while Europe starved. The City of Lights destroyed the German worldview in seconds. The propaganda of the degenerate, failing nation evaporated. They were looking at a titan, a monster of industry and logistics that was fully awake yet sleeping in a bed of luxury. Standing on that deck, shivering in the wind, the German POWs didn't need to read a newspaper to know the score. They looked at the blazing skyline of New York, and then they looked at each other. The arrogance vanished from their faces. "We have lost," one man said simply. "We just haven't stopped fighting yet." For the first time, they understood the scale of their enemy. They were fighting a nation that could leave the lights on, and against that kind of power, bravery was useless.
The port of New York faded behind them, but the shock was only just beginning. After the overwhelming visual assault of the City of Lights, the German prisoners of war were marched to the rail yards. They were men who had spent years on the Eastern Front or in the deserts of North Africa. To them, military transport meant one thing: cattle cars. They expected to be shoved into freezing, filthy wooden boxes, standing shoulder to shoulder, smelling of sweat and dysentery. That was how the Third Reich moved its prisoners. That was how the Third Reich moved its own soldiers. Instead, they were ordered to board Pullman passenger coaches. The German soldiers hesitated at the doors. Inside, they saw upholstered velvet seats. There were clean windows. There was heating. There were sleeping berths. Some of the prisoners actually refused to enter at first, thinking it was a trick, a psychological trap designed to lower their guard. But the MPs just waved them in with bored expressions. As the trains began to move, heading west, the prisoners settled into a stunned silence. They were comfortable, they were warm, and they were about to learn the most terrifying lesson of the war. The journey didn't end in a few hours. It didn't end in a day. The train rolled on and on and on. In Europe, geography is dense. You can travel for 5 hours and cross 2 national borders, 3 distinct cultures, and 4 major rivers. Space is limited. Every inch of land is fought over. But in America, the horizon seemed to go on forever. They traveled through Pennsylvania and Ohio, passing steel mills that stretched for miles. In the Ruhr Valley, German factories were camouflaged, buried underground, or surrounded by flak towers to protect them from Allied bombers. Here, the factories were out in the open. They were massive, smoking beasts, lit up at night, churning out tanks and planes with zero fear of attack. The prisoners watched flatbed trains pass them in the other direction, carrying hundreds of Sherman tanks, thousands of jeeps, millions of artillery shells. It was a river of steel, flowing endlessly toward the coast. Then came the Midwest. The landscape opened up into the Great Plains. For days, the prisoners stared out at fields of wheat and corn that had no end. In Germany, people were mixing sawdust into their bread to make the flour last. Here, the grain rotted on the ground because there was too much of it to harvest. A famous anecdote from this period involves a young lieutenant captured in Tunisia. After traveling on the train for 3 days and 3 nights, he asked an American guard, "Where are we? Are we in China yet?" The guard laughed. "China? Buddy, we haven't even left Texas." The lieutenant looked at the map. He realized with a sinking heart that the state of Texas alone was larger than the entire nation of Germany. The psychological impact of this distance was devastating. They realized that even if the Wehrmacht somehow defeated Britain, even if they conquered Russia, they could never touch this. America was not just a country, it was a continent. It was a fortress protected by 2 oceans and thousands of miles of land. The food on the train reinforced this defeat. At mealtimes, porters, often African Americans, whom the Nazis had dismissed as an inferior race, served the prisoners white bread, thick stews with chunks of beef, and coffee, real coffee, not the ersatz acorn water they had been drinking in Europe for years. One prisoner, a pilot named Fritz, later wrote about watching a guard finish half a sandwich and then casually throw the rest out the window. Fritz stared at the discarded food in horror. In Germany, throwing away bread was a crime. Here, it was just trash. The abundance was so casual, so careless that it hurt. By the time the trains reached the POW camps in Oklahoma and Kansas, the fighting spirit of the prisoners had been crushed. They hadn't been beaten by torture or interrogation. They had been beaten by the view from a train window. They saw a nation with no bomb craters. They saw a rail network that was perfectly intact. They saw a land where food grew in infinite supply and factories hummed 24 hours a day without fear of attack. The prisoners watched flatbed trains pass them in the other direction, carrying hundreds of Sherman tanks, thousands of jeeps, millions of artillery shells. It was a river of steel, flowing endlessly toward the coast. The one German officer, stepping off the train after a 4-day journey, handed his cap to an American sergeant and said simply, "I was a fool. We never stood a chance. You cannot fight geography." The endless horizon of America had done what the Red Army and the Royal Air Force could not. It made the German soldier realize that the Third Reich was not the master of the world. It was just a small, angry island waiting to be crushed by a continent.
The barbed wire fences of Camp Aliceville in Alabama or Camp Hearn in Texas were built to keep the Germans in. But for the men inside, the wire served a different purpose. It separated the starving world they had come from the land of plenty they had just entered. The first shock of the arsenal of democracy wasn't a tank or a plane. It was dinner. In the Wehrmacht, by 1943, rations were a science of scarcity. A soldier survived on hard rye bread, ersatz coffee made from roasted barley, and occasional tins of watery stew. Hunger was a constant companion. When the POWs marched into the American mess halls, they stopped dead. The air smelled of frying grease and brewing coffee, real coffee made from beans. They lined up with their trays, suspicious and confused. Then came the scoops. Potatoes, green beans, corn, and meat. Not a sliver of gristle, but a slab of beef or a heavy ladle of stew. And on the side, white bread. To a European, white bread was like cake. It was a luxury reserved for the rich or the sick. Here, it was stacked in towers. One prisoner recorded in his diary that he thought it was a trick. He whispered to his bunkmate, "They are fattening us up," he whispered. "They want to show the world how well they treat prisoners before they execute us." But the execution never came. The meals just kept coming. Breakfast brought eggs, bacon, and milk. Lunch brought sandwiches with butter, real butter, not margarine. The Geneva Convention stipulated that POWs must be fed the same quality of rations as the captor's own troops. Since the U.S. Army was the best-fed army in history, the German prisoners were eating better than General Rommel himself. But the true display of American power happened when they were sent to work. To address the labor shortage, the U.S. government leased POWs out to local farmers. The Germans, many of whom were from rural Bavaria or Prussia, considered themselves expert farmers. They expected to see the Americans struggling. They expected to see women and children pulling plows, just as they were doing back in Germany, where all the horses had been requisitioned for the Eastern Front. Instead, they walked into the fields and saw the machines. In Germany, a harvest was a community effort. It took 20 men with scythes and sickles to clear a field of wheat. In Kansas, the POWs watched in stunned silence as a single American teenager sat atop a roaring red farmall tractor pulling a combine harvester. The machine chewed through the field, threshing and bagging the grain in a single motion. It was a massacre of the wheat, one prisoner noted. One boy and a machine did the work of an entire village. They saw the lazy American efficiency. The Americans didn't work hard, they worked smart. They didn't use a shovel if they could use a bulldozer. They didn't walk if they could drive. The POWs saw trucks everywhere, not military trucks, but farm trucks, delivery trucks, personal pickups. And then there was the waste. This, perhaps more than the abundance, terrified the Germans. A German soldier was trained to save everything. You reused your coffee grounds, you saved string, you patched your boots until they fell apart.
Conservation was the highest virtue of the Reich. But the Americans, they were reckless. The prisoners watched American guards take a few puffs of a cigarette and then flick it into the dirt, only half smoked. To a German, that half cigarette was currency, it was wealth. To the American, it was nothing. They saw food thrown into the garbage because it was cold or stale. They saw crates of equipment left out in the rain because there was simply no room in the warehouse. The message was clear and devastating. We have so much, we don't even need to care. One afternoon, a German sergeant working in a canning factory in the Midwest watched thousands of tins of corn rolling off a conveyor belt. He turned to his fellow prisoner and said, "Look at this. This is why we will lose. In Germany, we are counting bullets. Here, they can't even count the cans of corn." It was a profound psychological defeat. They realized that Germany was fighting a war of arithmetic. They were trying to subtract Allied soldiers one by one, but America was fighting a war of multiplication. For every tank the Germans destroyed, Detroit built 10. For every U-boat that sank a ship, the shipyards built 3. The arsenal of democracy wasn't just a slogan, it was a physical reality of abundance that defied the laws of physics the Germans understood. As they lay in their bunks at night, bellies full of American beef, listening to the distant whistle of freight trains carrying yet more supplies to the coast, they knew the truth. The war wasn't going to be decided by bravery or tactics, it was going to be decided by the sheer crushing weight of stuff. And America had all of it.
The defeat of the German soldier did not always happen on the battlefield. For thousands of prisoners of war sitting in the camps of Texas, Oklahoma, and Mississippi, the surrender happened quietly, in the silence of their own minds. By late 1944, the American government had launched a formal re-education program. They wanted to denazify the prisoners, teaching them about democracy and the Bill of Rights. But the American officers quickly realized that they didn't need lectures, they didn't need propaganda films, they just needed to leave the newspapers out. In the mess halls, the camp commanders began leaving copies of the New York Times and local papers on the tables. At first, the hardcore Nazis, the Lager Gestapo, who tried to enforce discipline inside the camps, forbade the men from reading them. Jewish lies, they screamed, propaganda. But curiosity is a powerful force. Slowly, the men began to read. They didn't find the screaming, hysterical headlines of the Volkscher Beobachter back home. They found dry, boring statistics. They found stock market reports. And they found maps. The maps were the hardest thing to look at. They showed the front lines moving. Week by week, the lines crept closer to the German border. The prisoners cross-referenced these American lies with the letters they received from home. When a mother in Cologne wrote that her house had been bombed and the American newspaper reported a raid on Cologne on the exact same day, the cognitive dissonance shattered. The Americans were telling the truth. This was the psychological breaking point. The German soldiers realized that their own government had been lying to them for years, while the enemy was casually handing them the facts. The delusion of the Wunderwaffen, the wonder weapons, was the last hope to die. For months, prisoners whispered that Hitler was about to unleash a weapon so powerful it would turn the tide. They clung to the rumors of V-2 rockets and jet fighters. But then they looked out the window. In the skies over the American camps, they often saw training flights. They didn't see 1 or 2 planes. They saw formations of B-17s and B-24s that darkened the sun, stretching from horizon to horizon. They watched new squadrons of fighters roaring overhead, flown by boys who had learned to fly in weeks, burning fuel as if it were water. A German Luftwaffe pilot, imprisoned in Mississippi, watched a training wing of hundreds of bombers fly over his camp. He turned to his fellow prisoner and said, "It doesn't matter if Hitler has a jet plane. It doesn't matter if he has a magic rocket. Look at that. They are building machines faster than we can build bullets. Even if we shoot down 1,000 of them, they will just build 2,000 more tomorrow. The letters home began to change. The censors in Germany noticed a terrifying trend. The POWs weren't writing about escape or victory. They were writing about surrender. Dear Mother, stop listening to the radio. The war is lost. I am working on a farm in America. The farmer has a car. His wife has a car. They eat meat 3 times a day. We are fighting against people who have conquered hunger. Save yourself. Do not die for a lie. When the war finally ended in May 1945, there was no shock in the American camps. There was only a dull, heavy acceptance. They had known it was over for a long time. The final cruelty came when they were shipped back. In 1946, these men, healthy, tan, well-fed on American beef and corn, were put back on ships and sent to Europe. They arrived in a Germany that looked like the surface of the moon. They walked through the rubble of Hamburg and Berlin, past the skeletal, starving figures of their countrymen who had survived the bombings. The returning POWs were strangers in their own land. They were the only Germans who truly understood why they had lost. They had seen the other side of the ocean. They had seen the endless wheat fields, the glowing cities, and the smoking factories of Detroit. They knew that Germany hadn't been defeated by a superior philosophy or a braver soldier. They had been crushed by a giant that simply didn't know how to stop building. The psychological surrender was complete. They returned to the ruins, not with anger, but with the quiet, devastating knowledge that they had challenged the impossible, and the impossible had simply rolled over them.